If only the king knew how lazy I am. Like, genuinely, truly. If this man knew that 3 days before I ended up here, I called my coworker Kevin from 15 feet away instead of walking to his desk, if he knew I once submitted a workplace discomfort report because my chair was too far from my monitor, if he knew that my entire career strategy at Brightfield Consulting in downtown Chicago was to make myself so agreeably useless that nobody would ever give me real work again, he would not be losing sleep over me. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 27 years old. I am, or I was, a senior administrative coordinator at Brightfield Consulting Group on the 14th floor of a glass building on Michigan Avenue, where the coffee machine was 12 steps from my desk, and I considered that a commute. My cousin Derek is the CEO. I would like to clarify that I got the job on my own merits. I would also like to clarify that Derek has covered for me 17 times in the last calendar year and once told HR that my chronic lateness was a medical accommodation. It is not a medical accommodation. I just really hate mornings. Here is how I died. Or, again, not died exactly. Relocated. Without a consent. Without a forwarding address. But here is how the original departure happened. I was in my apartment on a Tuesday evening watching BL Stories by Kay on YouTube while horizontal on my couch, which is where I do all my best thinking. I had spilled a glass of water on the floor the night before. Not a small spill, a significant spill. The kind of spill that a responsible adult would have cleaned up immediately. I am not a responsible adult. I looked at that spill, I acknowledged that spill, I made a promise to that spill that I would handle it after the next episode. And then I fell asleep. The next morning, Tuesday, technically, I woke up. I needed water. My phone was charging across the room. I got up in the dark, in my socks, moving at the speed of a person who still has 2 hours before anything matters, and I stepped directly into yesterday's water. My socks did what wet socks do on hardwood. My feet went one direction, my body went another. The back of my head introduced itself to the corner of my coffee table, and that was that. I did not feel pain. I felt something like a very aggressive blink, and then I was somewhere else. I woke up in a cold stone room that smelled like old candles and grief. The bed was wide and empty, and the sheets were the kind of heavy linen that says nobody here has ever heard of thread count. There were tapestries on the wall, actual tapestries. There was a fireplace that had gone mostly cold, and on the nightstand, there was a journal. I stared at the ceiling for 3 minutes processing the situation. Then I picked up the journal. Okay, so it took me 4 hours to read the whole thing because I kept having to stop and say out loud to nobody, "He did what?" The man whose body I was now occupying, God rest his soul, genuinely, rest well, King. His name was Callum Voss, Lord Consort Callum Voss to be exact, husband by marriage to King Roland Voss of the Voss Kingdom. A kingdom I am going to go ahead and describe as Michigan, but colder and with more politics and no decent food. Callum had been married to King Roland for 3 years. 3 years of begging for scraps. I want you to understand the full picture here. This man, this sweet, earnest, absolutely unwell man, spent 1,095 days trying to earn the love of a husband who had decided before the wedding that he would never give it. The king married Callum because the Voss Kingdom's treasury was empty, and Callum's family controlled the northern trade routes. It was a political transaction. The king made his feelings about that transaction very clear from day one. And Callum, bless him, I am serious, bless this man, responded by trying harder. He waited at the front gate when the king returned from military campaigns, in the rain, on multiple documented occasions. The journal has a whole section about which shoes gave him the least blisters during gate vigils. He brewed the king's morning tea by hand, every single morning. Not because the kitchen staff couldn't do it, they absolutely could. He did it because he wanted it to be personal. He wanted the king to know that these hands, specifically, had made this cup. I am going to tell you what happened with that tea. The king had it poured on him. Not by the king directly. The king didn't do it himself, but the king's personal aide did it on instruction. And when Callum reported this, the king said, and I am reading directly from this journal, "If you insist on presenting yourself as a servant, you will be treated as one." Sir. He cleaned the king's armor after battle campaigns. He cleared the king's plates. He was eventually banned from the king's dining table entirely, made to eat in his chambers alone, and he accepted this and wrote in his journal that he hoped the king had enjoyed his soup. Page 47. Did not weep tonight. Consider this a victory. I read that 3 times. I read it 3 times, and then I put the journal down and sat in the silence of that cold stone room and took a full accounting of my situation the way I would assess a work project that had been dumped on my desk without context. What is the current status? Bad. Death warrant exists. Name on it. Signed by the king. Currently paused but not cancelled. Charges? Alleged poisoning of the royal food supply. Actual culprit, the court advisors, who needed Callum gone because his family's trade routes gave him political leverage they couldn't control. The king believed the accusation. Of course he did. He never liked Callum to begin with. Why would he question something that confirmed what he already wanted to believe? Who are the stakeholders? One cold, controlled, politically powerful king who is operating under the assumption that the person in this bed is still the same person he left weeping in this room. A general named James Callaway, who the journal describes as the one person in the palace who was ever quietly decent to Callum, not out of pity, but out of some private sense of fairness. The kitchen staff and the chamber servants who were loyal to Callum because he had always been kind to them even when they didn't need to be. And the court advisors, the actual villains of this situation, who were watching the Lord Consort like hawks because they needed to make sure the death warrant got carried out before anyone looked too closely at their fingerprints on the poisoning accusation. What are my assets? The servant loyalty, James Callaway's quiet decency, the knowledge, the very specific, very useful knowledge that I had been watching BL Stories by K for 2 years, and I knew exactly how this genre went. I knew the beats, I knew the moves, I knew what the original husband did wrong, and I knew what worked. I also knew, from watching my cousin Derek navigate 17 hostile board situations in 3 years, how power actually moves in rooms where nobody is saying what they mean. What is my strategy? I am going to tell you my strategy. The man who used to live in this body did everything wrong. Not wrong as in morally wrong, wrong as in tactically catastrophic. He performed desperation. He performed need. He handed the king all of his softness, and the king used it to wipe his boots. You cannot make someone love you by being available to them at all times. You cannot win respect by doing their servants' jobs for them. You cannot negotiate from a position of 0. I am not going to do any of that. New body, same laziness, completely different energy. The king wants a ghost? He's about to get a problem. I got out of bed for the first time, looked around the palace suite, noticed that nobody had come to bring me breakfast even though it was clearly past morning, and my first act as Lord Consort Callum Voss was to find a servant and ask where the kitchen was because I was hungry and nothing was going to happen to me before I ate. The servant's name was Petra. She was about 19, had the look of someone who had fully accepted that her job came with high emotional stakes, and when I opened the door to my chambers and said, very calmly, very politely, "Good morning. I need food. Can you take me to the kitchen or bring something up? Either one is fine." She looked at me like I had just announced I could fly. She said, "My lord, the king has returned and is asking for your presence in the East Hall." I said, "That is wonderful. Where is the kitchen?" She blinked. She looked at me. I looked at her. She went and got me bread and soft cheese and something warm in a cup that was not quite coffee but was trying its best, and I ate all of it before I went anywhere. Look, I needed the fuel. I was making strategic calculations. Their first interaction, per the journal, went like this. King Roland returns. Lord Consort Callum is already at the gate, has been at the gate for an hour, in full formal dress, visibly emotional. The king acknowledges him with a single cold glance and walks inside. Callum follows. The king says something clipped. Callum says something earnest and small. The king dismisses him. Callum goes back to his room and cries. My first interaction with King Roland Voss went somewhat differently. I was in the wrong wing of the palace. I had taken a wrong turn after breakfast because the palace was the size of 2 Chicago city blocks, and nobody gave me a map. I was standing in what turned out to be the Armory hallway when a tall man in travel-worn dark clothing rounded the corner with 4 guards and stopped. He was... Okay, I will say this once, and I am not going to make it a whole thing. The king was built like someone who had never in his life been told no. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, the kind of posture that is either natural authority or very expensive physical training. Dark eyes, exactly as cold as advertised. He looked at me standing in his armory hallway holding a piece of bread I had forgotten to finish. I looked at him. He said, "You are not at the gate." His voice was flat. It wasn't a question. It was an observation delivered in the tone of a man who was not sure if he was offended or simply noting a change in weather. I said, "I was not aware of the specific timing of your arrival. Is there something you need?" The guards behind him went visibly still. I could see it in my peripheral vision, 4 people deciding simultaneously whether to intervene. King Roland's expression did something complicated. He was expecting, I could see him expecting it, the flinch, the apology, the scramble. He was expecting Callum to fold in on himself the way Callum always did, producing some variation of, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, please don't be angry with me." I was not going to give him that. In my head, I was doing what I always did when Derek walked into a room in CEO mode on a bad quarter. I was tracking the power signals, keeping my own energy neutral and waiting to see what the actual ask was before I responded to anything. The king looked at the bread in my hand. He looked at my face. He said very precisely, "The Lord Consort is expected to receive the king upon his return." I said, "I understand that's the tradition. I'll note it for next time." I paused. Was there something specific for today, or... "You are dismissed," he said, cold, final. I said, "Of course." And I walked back toward my wing at a pace that was not hurried. I want to be clear about what happened internally during this interaction. I was not performing calm. I was simply genuinely not afraid of this man, the way Callum had been. Callum had 3 years of accumulated longing and rejection living in his chest. I had a plate of bread and cheese and the information that this man had signed a death warrant for someone who loved him. I was not going to perform sadness for him. But I was also paying attention, and what I noticed walking away from that hallway was that the king had not moved. He stood there and watched me walk away. That was the first interesting data point. James Callaway found me 2 days later. He showed up at my chamber's door at mid-morning, which was a time I was currently using to lie horizontal and mentally review everything I knew about court politics from a combination of Succession and the Journal. He was a big man, the general, broad, careful, with the eyes of someone who had been watching powerful people make mistakes for a long time and had learned to see the patterns. The Journal said he had always been quietly decent. His face, in person, said he was also genuinely curious. He said, "My lord, you seem well." I said, "I am not bad. Come in." He came in. He sat when I gestured at the chair. He watched me watch him, and then he said, and I appreciated this because it was direct, "You are not who you were." I said, "People change." He said, "Not in 2 days." I looked at him. He looked at me. I thought, okay, this is the ally. This is the person the original had but never fully used because he was too busy begging for the king's attention to notice who was actually in his corner. I said, "Tell me what I need to know about the advisors." His eyebrows went up about a 1/4 inch, which I was beginning to understand was James Callaway's version of being shocked. He told me, "The 3 senior court advisors, Harmon, Breck, and a woman named Counselor Wade, who was the most dangerous of the 3, had been maneuvering against the Lord Consort for 2 years. Their problem wasn't Callum personally. Their problem was the northern trade routes that Callum's family controlled. As long as Callum was alive and married to the king, the trade route agreements gave him standing, political capital, leverage even if Callum had no idea how to use it. If Callum died under the king's warrant, the trade route agreements would have to be renegotiated, and the advisors had their own financial arrangements with certain competing interests that would benefit enormously from that renegotiation. The poisoning accusation was manufactured. James knew it. He couldn't prove it at the time because the evidence had been constructed carefully, and the king was not in a mood to look closely at anything that involved the Lord Consort. The death warrant was still active. The advisors had a second move planned, something involving the border negotiation coming up in 3 weeks. James didn't have full details yet. I lay completely still for about 20 seconds processing all of this. James watched me. Then I sat up and said, "Okay, I need 3 things from you. First, everything you know or can find out about what the advisors are planning for the border negotiation. Second, I need to know which servants they have on their side, because someone is reporting back to them, and I need to know who. Third, I need you not to mention any of this to the king yet." James said, "The king would want to know if his advisors are compromised." I said, "The king also almost had me executed on their word. He can wait." James looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are not going to forgive him." I said, "I'm going to solve the problem. Forgiveness is a separate conversation, and we are not having it today." Something shifted in James Callaway's expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. He said, "I will find out what I can." Good. That was good. I made a list after he left. I like lists. They're the lazy person's project management system. You do the thinking all at once, and then you just work through the items. My list looked like this: stay alive, remove the active death warrant, dismantle the advisors before they execute their next move, do not under any circumstances return to the behavior of the previous occupant of this body, get someone to fix the temperature in these chambers because it is unreasonably cold and I refuse to be a martyr about it. Item 5 went into motion that same afternoon. I told Petra, who had apparently decided she was my person now, that the room needed 2 more braziers, better blankets, and that morning meals should arrive by the time I was awake and not after, because I was not going to start my days hungry on top of everything else. Petra looked at me with the expression of a person who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask for things. She said, "Yes, my lord," and she went and handled it. See, that is the thing about the original Callum. He was so deep in self-denial, so trained by rejection to feel like he didn't deserve anything, that he stopped asking for what he was legitimately entitled to. He was a Lord Consort. He had rank. He had a household budget. He had staff whose entire purpose was to serve this suite. And instead of using any of that, he was brewing tea by hand at 5 in the morning for a man who was going to pour it on him. I was not going to do that. Here is what I changed, and here's how I changed it. I stopped being available. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. I just stopped. The gate vigil stopped because I was simply never at the gate when the king returned. I was somewhere else, doing something else, reading, eating, talking to Petra, reviewing notes with James. The armor cleaning stopped because when the armor came back from campaign, I was in the middle of a meal, and I sent it to the armory staff where it belonged. The tea stopped because I was sleeping at the hours when the tea was previously being brewed, and I had instructed the kitchen to send my breakfast to my chambers like a normal person in my position should have been doing for years. The servants were delighted. I want to explain this. When someone in power is visibly small and self-defeating, the people around them go one of 2 ways. They either feel sorry and protective, or they start taking advantage of the weakness because the weakness is all they see. Callum had generated the first category in the serving staff, but there was something sad in it. They felt bad for him. They cared for him out of pity as much as loyalty. When I started asking for things, actually asking, with clarity, "Please bring me this, please schedule that, please handle this other thing," the energy changed. They weren't protecting me out of pity anymore. They were working for a Lord Consort who had an opinion about the temperature of his rooms and knew exactly what he wanted for breakfast. There is a dignity in that for everyone. I've seen it happen in offices. You treat yourself like you have standing, and the people around you adjust accordingly. The advisors were watching all of this. I knew they were watching because James confirmed it, and because I could see Counselor Wade's very controlled expression during the 2 court events I attended that second week. She was recalibrating. She was trying to figure out what the change meant and whether it changed their timeline. It didn't ultimately change what they were planning, but it changed how they were feeling about their certainty. And the king? Okay, I'll tell you about the king. He started a appearing places. Not with ceremony, not with announcement, he would just be there. I would turn from a conversation with a court steward about the household accounts, and the king would be 10 feet away, apparently reviewing something, except he had not been there 30 seconds earlier. I would be in the upper garden, which I had adopted as my primary thinking location because it was warmer and had a decent view, and the king would come through on what he described as an inspection of the garden wall. He never spoke to me on these occasions. He acknowledged me with a nod, maybe, sometimes less, but he was there. I understood what that was. I had seen Derek do the same thing with people who surprised him. Hover at the edges of a room because he wasn't ready to engage directly, but he also couldn't stop tracking the situation. The king had built a version of Callum in his head over 3 years. Sad, desperate, available, predictable. And that version had disappeared. He didn't know what to do with the absence of it. He wasn't ready to approach me, but he couldn't stop noticing me. I treated this exactly the way I treated Derek in those situations. I let him hover. I didn't accommodate it. I didn't perform anything for the audience of one. I had my conversations, I ate my meals, I conducted my business, and I let him observe whatever he wanted to observe from a safe distance. The bread, I had decided, was excellent. Someone in this palace knew how to bake bread, and I had found them, and I had requested it specifically every morning, and it was a point of genuine happiness in an otherwise complicated situation. Small victories. The court incident happened during a trade review session, which I was technically required to attend because the northern trade routes were in discussion and I had standing to speak. I want to be honest. I had not planned to say anything. I was there to observe. I had a cup of something warm and a very pleasant roll that Petra had thought to send with me, and I was sitting in my designated seat paying attention while various advisors presented positions. And then Counselor Wade said something. She said it smoothly, worked it into the middle of a longer argument about route tariffs, and if I hadn't been watching for it, I would have missed it. A small, careful implication that the Lord Consort's family's trade agreements contained a clause that could be interpreted as a conflict of interest in the current negotiation. It was not an accusation. It was a suggestion, designed to establish before anyone consciously registered it that my standing here was questionable. It was elegant. I will give her that. I took a small bite of my roll. And then I said, very calmly, without looking up from my cup, the clause Counselor Wade is referencing applies to direct trade competition, not advisory participation. It was written specifically to prevent trade families from negotiating their own tariff rates, which is not what this session involves. The Lord Consort's participation is not a conflict of interest under that clause. It never has been. If the council would like, I can have the original agreement language pulled from the household records. It's in the 3rd annex. Silence. I looked up. Counselor Wade was looking at me with an expression that had gone very, very still. I said, "Is there anything else on that point, or should we move forward?" We moved forward. I finished my roll. I paid attention for the rest of the session. When it ended and people were filing out, I asked a passing steward if there were any savory pastries left from the morning service, and he said he would check. James Callaway materialized at my shoulder with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been watching that exchange very closely. He said, "Where did you learn that?" I said, "I have a cousin who runs a company." He said, "That was—" He stopped. He looked at me. "That was extremely well done." I said, "I know. Is there a pastry situation or not?" There was not. Disappointing, but otherwise a solid morning. The king came to my chambers that night. He came alone, which I noted. No guards, past the hour when formal visits happened. He knocked, which I also noted because I had the strong sense he was a man who did not typically knock, and when I said come in, he entered and stood in the middle of my room and looked at me like I was something he was trying to categorize. I was in bed, which is where I spent most of my evenings, reading the trade agreement annexes because I had decided that if I was going to use them as a weapon, I should actually understand them. I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, "Who are you?" Not what happened to you, not even a question technically, a statement. Who are you? And here is the thing. I had planned, in a vague way, to have something useful and strategic to say if this moment ever came. Something that would manage his expectations and establish a dynamic and set me up well for the next several moves. I looked at this man who had signed a death warrant for someone who waited for him at the gate in the rain, who had spent 3 years being genuinely terrible to a person whose only crime was loving him too obviously. I said, "Optimus Prime." King Roland Voss looked at me. I looked back. He left. I listened to his footsteps go down the corridor. Then I put down my annex and lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. That was either very smart or very stupid, and I would not know which for several days. I found out from Petra the next morning that James Callaway had been waiting in the corridor outside my door, as apparently he had been doing some light surveillance on the situation. And when the king came out, James said, "Your Majesty," and the king said, with absolutely no expression, "Optimus Prime," and kept walking. James had written it down. He came to me the next morning and said, "What is Optimus Prime?" I said, "A very powerful figure from my homeland." James looked at me for a long moment and said, "Right," in the tone of a man who had decided to accept things he could not explain. Good enough. 3 weeks later, it was time for the border negotiation. James had gotten me the details by the second week. The advisor's plan was this. They were going to surface the death warrant during the negotiation. Specifically, they were going to suggest that the Lord Consort's suspicious behavioral changes in recent weeks raised new questions about the original poisoning accusation, and that the still active warrant should be executed before the negotiation concluded, to avoid any claims later that the outcome had been influenced by someone under a criminal investigation. It was actually a smart play. The negotiation involved trade partners who needed to trust the stability of the Voss kingdom's internal governance. If there was public uncertainty about a standing death warrant, if the advisors could make it look like the king was wavering, distracted, influenced by a potentially corrupt consort, they could use the disruption to push through their preferred trade terms, which benefited their outside financial arrangements, and eliminate me in the process. 2 problems solved at once. I lay on my back for 20 minutes after James finished explaining this. Then I made a list. I had spent 2 weeks quietly using the servant network, specifically Petra and 3 others who moved through different parts of the palace and had confirmed no advisor loyalties, feeding pieces of information to different people in the court. Not false information exactly, selectively framed information. I had mentioned in one conversation that I knew would travel, that the Northern Trade Route family had recently updated their agreements with additional clauses. I had mentioned in another conversation that I had been reviewing the annex materials because certain historical precedents seemed relevant to the upcoming negotiation. I had made sure that one specific piece of misinformation reached Counselor Wade's people, that the death warrant, if executed during an active international negotiation, would trigger a legal review clause in the trade agreements that would pause all Northern Route commerce for 6 months pending an independent audit. There was no such clause, but Counselor Wade spent 4 days trying to find it, which meant she had 4 days of slightly distracted preparation for the negotiation itself, during which James confirmed that her evidence for the warrant service, the so-called new information about my behavioral changes, was based on servant reports that had been fed to her by 3 people who were now feeding her what I wanted her to hear. The day of the negotiation, the trade partners arrived. The session was formal, long, catered with food that I had, through Petra, confirmed was actually good, because I was going to be sitting here for several hours, and I had standards now. The king was at the head of the table. I was at my designated seat, which was technically close to the king's because of rank, a fact the advisors had never fully figured out how to work around. Counselor Wade made her move 90 minutes in. She raised the warrant, framed it as a question of stability, of governance integrity, of the kingdom's credibility in international dealings. She was smooth. She was prepared. She presented it as a concern raised by multiple advisors, which was true because they had coordinated, which meant that when I responded, I was responding to all three of them at once. I waited for her to finish. I said, "The concern is noted. For the record of this session, I'd like to enter the Lord Consort's household account logs from the 6 weeks preceding the original poisoning accusation. Specifically, the supply receipts, which show that none of the flagged kitchen materials came through my household inventory, but 3 of them correspond exactly to supply orders documented in the Senior Advisory Council's operational budget." I paused. I said, "I had been reviewing the annex materials. I found some things." The room went very quiet. Counselor Wade's face was still, but her stillness had changed quality. She was no longer the stillness of controlled confidence. It was the stillness of someone standing on ground that had just moved. I said, and I am proud of this because I practiced the delivery, I would also note that the legal review clause the Council may have been referencing from the Northern Trade Agreements was amended in the 3rd revision and no longer applies in the form described. I mention this because it seems like it might be relevant to how certain parties have been calculating their options. James, across the table, was looking at me with the expression of a man witnessing something he would be describing to people for the rest of his life. The trade partners were looking between the advisors and me with the polite wariness of people who had just understood that something very interesting was happening, and that they should probably wait to see how it resolved before signing anything. The king— I looked at the king without meaning to. It was a reflex. He was looking at me. Not with coldness, not with the controlled blankness he typically wore. He was looking at me the way you look at something you've been walking past every day when you suddenly see what it actually is. I looked away. I was not ready to do anything with that. We had business to finish. The senior advisors were removed from the session on the king's order before the main negotiation resumed. Harmon and Breck went quietly. Counselor Wade looked at me on her way out with an expression that I can only describe as professional respect, which I understood because I felt the same way about her. She was good. She was just working for the wrong side, and she got outmaneuvered. The negotiation concluded without incident. The trade partners signed. The terms were, by all accounts, the best the Voss Kingdom had gotten from these partners in a decade. I ate 3 pastries afterward because I had earned them. The formal cancellation of the death warrant happened the next morning. The king signed it in front of the remaining council, which had been reduced significantly and was now being supervised by James, who had been elevated to senior advisory status in what I can only assume was the fastest institutional restructuring this kingdom had ever seen. James came and told me afterward. He looked pleased in the careful, contained way of someone who had been working toward a version of this outcome for a long time. I said, "Good." He said, "The king wants to see you." I said, "I know." I waited until after breakfast. The king received me in his private study, not the throne room, which I noted. The study was smaller, less formal. Books on the walls, maps on a table, a fireplace that was actually blessedly warm. He was standing when I arrived. He waited until the door closed. Then he said, "How did you know?" Not "thank you." Not even, "I'm sorry." Not even a preamble. Straight to the question. I respected it, honestly. I said, "I watched a show called Succession. It's about a family that runs a media company and they spend 7 seasons trying to destroy each other. I found it educational." He looked at me. He said, "I don't know what that means." I said, "It doesn't matter." He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the desk and then back at me. He said, "You saved the kingdom." I said, "I saved myself and the kingdom benefited." Another silence. He said, "What do you want?" And the thing is, I had expected this question. I had thought about it. And I had seen in every account of this kind of moment, in every story I had ever read, the person in my position make a very particular kind of speech. They list what they suffered. They say they want love, acknowledgement, warmth. They make themselves vulnerable in the exact way that they've been vulnerable all along, just with better timing. I was not going to do that. Not because I didn't have grievances. I had a journal full of someone else's grievances and 3 weeks of my own. Not because the king didn't owe something serious to the person he had spent 3 years dismissing. He did. That accounting was not finished. But I was not going to accept warmth as a reward for surviving an assassination attempt. That was not how this worked. I said, I want 3 things. The first, a bed that is warmer. The suite has been improved, but the main chamber still runs cold at night, and I am not going to keep waking up in the dark because the palace was built by people who apparently considered comfort a personal failing. Second, the kitchen delivers faster. I have been waiting up to 40 minutes for morning meals, and that is a problem with no good solution, because I know they can move faster than that. Third, nobody pours anything hot on me, ever again, for any reason. If there is a policy confusion about this, please have it addressed in writing. The king looked at me. I looked at the king. Something changed in his face. It was slow and it was uncertain, and I could see him working against something, working against whatever it was he had built up over 3 years to avoid feeling anything about the person he had married. And then he laughed. Not a polished, controlled sound, an actual, sudden, helpless laugh that he seemed surprised to hear from himself. It lasted only a moment, and then it was gone, and he was composed again. But it had been real. I had seen it. I said, I mean it about the hot liquids. He said, I'll see to it. I said, good, and I turned to leave. He said, Callum. I stopped. I looked back. He said, and he was choosing his words carefully, which I noted, because this was not a careful man in most of his dealings. Have not been... He stopped. Started again. What was done to you in this palace was not acceptable. I allowed it. I am aware of that. I looked at him for a moment. I said, I know. And then I left, because that was enough for today. That was exactly enough for one day and not a single word more. The forgiveness conversation was not happening yet. I had watched too many people forgive too quickly on sentimental timelines that had nothing to do with whether anything had actually changed, and I was not going to be that person. He had a lot of work to do. The kitchen was a test. The blankets were a test. The way he handled the next 12 months was the real conversation. We would see. 1 week later, I was in my chambers eating breakfast, which had arrived in under 20 minutes. Improvement noted. Petra got a small gift for managing that. Reading through some notes James had sent about the trade route formalizations when there was a knock at my door. I said, come in. The king came in. He was not in formal dress. He was in the kind of clothes that a powerful person wears when they are, experimentally, trying not to be performing their power at every moment. He stood in my doorway. He looked at the breakfast table. He looked at me. I looked at him. He sat down at the other chair at my breakfast table. Without asking, without announcing, just sat down. I looked at him. I looked at the bread basket. I slid it across the table without a word. He picked up a piece of bread. We sat there, and I ate my breakfast, and he ate bread, and nobody said anything. At some point, he said, the kitchen situation has been addressed. The head cook was mortified. I said, they should be. He said, the blanket situation was handled by your chambermaid. She apparently sent 3 strongly worded requests to the household quartermaster over the past week. I said, Petra is an excellent employee. He said, yes. A pause. She told the quartermaster that the Lord Consort had specifically requested that no further correspondence on the matter would be required because the blankets would simply be provided. I said, I coached her well. He almost smiled. We ate. Outside the window, the upper garden was doing the thing it did in late morning where the light came through from the east and made the whole space look slightly less like an ancient cold palace and slightly more like somewhere a reasonable person might choose to be. The bread was excellent, as usual. The warm cup was doing its job. The king sat there and did not leave. And I, for my part, did not ask him to. 3 weeks after that, I want to tell you about the conversation that happened in the hallway outside the East Council chamber because I feel like it is an important part of the record. The border trade formalization required one final sign-off from both the Lord Consort and the King in joint capacity. a technicality of the original treaty structure that nobody had flagged until the council solicitor reviewed the documents and turned slightly pale while explaining it to James, who turned slightly pale explaining it to me. I found the king in the hallway. I showed him the document. I explained the situation. He looked at the document. He looked at me. And then I said, I also want it understood that if the revised household arrangements are not documented in the official palace records, with my right to maintain them independent of any future change in our situation, I will take my inheritance and my family's trade agreements, and I will find somewhere warmer to be, permanently. The king stared at me. I looked back at him with the energy of a man who has done this exact move in 3 HR conversations and won all 3 times. He said, "Are you threatening me?" I said, "I am informing you. There is a difference." He said, and I will remember this for as long as I am in this body and possibly beyond. He looked at the document in his hand, and he looked at me, and he got down on one knee right there in the hallway outside the East Council chamber in front of 2 passing stewards and 1 very surprised guard, and he said, "Then I am asking you to stay." I looked at him on his knee on the stone floor. I said, "The household arrangements. Documented." He said, "Done." I said, "Warm blankets. Forever." He said, "I will personally review the quartermaster's inventory." I said, "Nobody pours." He said, "Nobody pours anything hot on you. It is in my standing orders. It will be in the palace charter if you require it." I looked at him. He looked at me from the floor. I said, "Get up. This is embarrassing for both of us." He stood. He handed me the document. He said, "Will you sign it?" I signed it. He signed it. The 2 passing stewards were going to be talking about this until they died, and I had come to terms with that. I want to be clear, for the record, about where things stand. I have not forgiven King Roland Voss because I am just too lazy to move out of the palace, and we are 3 weeks into a man who recently learned that the person he married was worth paying attention to. I am not grading on a generous curve here. He has a long way to go. But he had the bread this morning. And he asked Petra, apparently asked her directly, which she told me with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a solar event, whether I preferred the kind with seeds or without. I prefer without, she told him. He had the without kind sent up. It's not forgiveness, but it is data. And I am, as I have said, a very patient person when the alternative is effort. My name in this life, in this body, in this cold and increasingly manageable palace, is Lord Consort Callum Voss. I am occupying this position with the full weight of 27 years of strategic laziness, 2 years of BL Stories by Kay, and a lifetime of watching my cousin Derek Webb navigate every power structure imaginable with the core principle that you never negotiate from a position of 0. I am warm. I am fed. Nobody is pouring anything on me. And if the king wants to sit at my table every morning and eat bread without saying much of anything, he can sit at my table. But he is going to earn what comes after that. One day at a time.
The end.